To give you a little bit of logistical overview of what's going to happen, we'll have 3 panelists that will give short presentations of 20 minutes in length, and then we will go into a question and answer period of 30 minutes following all 3 speakers. The idea was we have a very complex and emerging problem in water management in the West, and we wanted to try to address it with a diversity of perspectives related to water. And so that's what we have for our panel today. It is actually, in some ways, I felt like a stand-up comic in introducing them, because we have an engineer, a philosopher, a biologist, all in an officers club, and so all of that came, and I was thinking, well, this is really a serious problem that we're trying to deal with, meeting the challenges of extreme growth in the West with tens of millions projected over the next quarter century, and a scarcity of water resources. The U.S. Department of Interior has identified or declared that most of the major metropolitan cities in the West will be subject to, or highly likely to experience, a water crisis over the next quarter century. So we've got a challenge, and we've got a great group of speakers to talk about it. Leading it off, we're going to have Dennis Strong, as Tom mentioned, and we're going to follow up with Anya Patinsky, and then Zack Frankel. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dennis Strong. Dennis is currently the director of the Utah Division of Water Resources, which is responsible for planning and management of water in the state of Utah. He has been with that organization for 30 years, so a very long time. He came to work at the division with as an engineer in the design and construction section after working several years in his family's construction business. He was promoted to construction coordinator, then chief of investigations and assistant director, and he was the division's deputy director for 5 years prior to being appointed as the director. A special note about him is that he has been involved with many of these type of complex projects, and problems throughout his career, and he's been able to bring together people from these different areas and work to develop solvable solutions. So thanks.
I hope it's just a different order and I don't get out of order. And we'll push the buttons and see what happens. Okay, so when I was driving up this morning thinking about a mission statement, and that's what I've entitled my remarks, I go, oh, some of those words are going to mean maybe something different to you than they do to me. And I thought of a story about a lion getting into heaven. And as they get to the end of the day and the end of the line, there's 2 fellows left. And the angel says, we're finished for the day. And you get a 10-day pass to go back to Earth. It can be anything you want. The first fellow said he enjoyed nature. And he enjoyed the beauty of nature. And he thought it would be very interesting and exciting to see the Earth from the eyes of an eagle. So immediately he's off. He's over Mirror Lake, enjoying seeing the Earth through the eyes of an eagle. The other fellow was, well, anyway, he said he wanted to be a stud. And you know, the angel kind of looked up at him and pointed at him, and immediately he found himself going round and round in a snow tire on his way up Big Cottonwood Canyon. So anyway, the point there, of course, is that when I say conservation, let me tell you what I'm saying, because it might be different than what you're thinking. When I say conservation today, I'm talking about using less water, and the water that we don't use becomes a supply for future use. So I'm not talking about leaving water in streams. I'm talking about meeting some of our future demand with the water that we save by being more water wise. The other word up there that may have a different meaning for you than me sometimes is protect. The protect part of my job as the Utah's Interstate Stream Commissioner is to protect Utah's right to use the water that has been allocated to us through state and federal agreements, through compacts. So that word protect, I kind of like to use it maybe the way some of you like to use it too, but specifically at Water Resources, it has to do with protect our right. Okay, the next couple of slides are just to tee up what I want to talk about and just point to some water issues and problems and challenges. I really like this picture of Lake Powell 12 years ago, only 12 years ago, and it's basically full. This is what it looks like today, and you can see the bathtub ring. It's at about 56%. Pretty good for 11 years of drought. The 56%, that's elevation 3620 for those of you who keep track of those kinds of things. I'm an engineer and I have to. The elevation is currently going down, but the elevation at the end of the water year is projected to be about 5 feet higher than it was last year. So that's good news. And if they're right about some of the storms and we keep getting storms and the snowpack doesn't sublimate, it actually does run off. The inflow into Lake Mead and Lake Powell could be even higher. Okay, so you've heard a lot. That's about all I'm going to say about all of the water that's going down to Lake Mead. No, we are not draining Lake Powell to fill Lake Mead. We are sending the water to Lake Mead that we are obligated by agreement. 2007, we entered into a coordinated reservoir operation agreement with the lower basin and the United States government. And so we're just sending the water down that we're obligated to under that agreement. And we're sending more than we would send if we didn't have that agreement. But that's okay. We made that agreement, and it's a cooperative agreement. It stays in place for about the next 15 years. Okay, so I'm old enough to remember when kids walked to school. I'm old enough to remember, some people ask about the old car, and it's really not about the old car. It's about when gas was a quarter. I remember when gas was a quarter. That's kind of scary. And I remember the Leavitt administration when it was thought that we had more water in the Colorado River than we could ever use. And when the executive director of the Department of Natural Resources, who is the organization that I'm in, would be my boss, when he said the only thing worse about selling our water to California would be to give it to them for nothing. So here's some numbers, engineers and numbers again. Today, 15 years later, and I just want to go through this slide with you quickly. Some of you have seen it before in presentations that I've made, and we've gone into a lot of detail. I'm not going to do that today. But in 1948, let's say right now, today, we've allocated most. When we get to the bottom of this slide, we've allocated most or used most of the water that we have in the Colorado River drainage, the compacted water. In 1948, a compact was entered into by the Upper Division states, and we knew then that the water supply that was estimated in 1922, when the Colorado River Compact was entered into, that the water supply was less. So we've known for a really long time that we didn't have as much water as they thought in 1922. 1948, the Upper Division states compacted that we would divide the water supply that remained for us based on percentage. Again, an observation, a statement that we knew there wasn't enough water to just divide it any other way than by percentage. And we divide about 6 million acre feet today. Utah's share, as you see, is just under 1.4 million acre feet. We use 1 million. Now let's look at what we're going to do with the rest of it. We have reserve water rights for Native Americans in Utah, and we have an obligation to provide water to them. And you can see that about half of the remaining water goes to fulfill that obligation. A little bit of additional agricultural development, some additional municipal development, and then more M&I development, municipal development, domestic development in the Lake Powell pipeline. So you subtract those, and you end up with about 20,000 acre feet. Not very much water. And especially when you look at some of the things that you'll talk about today, uncertainty, and talked about last night, uncertainty, we're getting really close to full allocation of our water supply. So, how will we meet future water needs? Water conservation, conversion of ag water, and new water development. And I'm going to go through those quickly. I need to set it up. Again, population. And I'm going to remind you, if you ask, I don't do population. Okay? That's not true. I got a bunch of kids and grandkids, but when we talk about these population numbers are from the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and they estimate by about 2050. Actually, they were saying closer to 6 million, but I think with the new population projections, we'll get back to where they were a few years ago, and down about over 5 million people by 2050. And so that's the charge that I have now, is to prepare a plan to provide water for those 5 million people. Okay, so now we're going to talk about water conservation for just a minute. If you look at the lines, you start down in the bottom left-hand corner area. The red line represents what happens if we just continued using domestic water the way we were using it in the year 2000. And you can see that the amount would be close to 2 million acre-feet by 2050. So in the year 2000, the Division and Board of Water Resources set a goal to reduce domestic water use by 25% by 2050. We think that's a realistic goal. That's doable. So the black line, or blue, I'm not sure what color it is. It looks blue on my screen. Shows that by reducing per capita water use by 25%, we develop 500,000 acre-feet of the 830,000 acre-feet we're going to need in the 50 years that are represented by the graph. That's huge. Okay, that's water that we're already drinking and using domestically. That's water that we will deliver mostly in systems that already exist. That's water that's high quality, therefore it will be inexpensive to treat, and that's code for it won't take a lot of energy. It's often high in the system, so we won't have to pump it up. Again, it's going to be less expensive, take less energy. So we've got not only a water savings, we have an energy savings in doing this. And I like to point that out, that we're doing both. We're very cognizant of the cost of energy involved in water treatment. It's not so high in Utah because of our topography and where we live, but it's still a considerable cost in providing water. Okay, the yellow line, that's how much water we have, and so subtract all of those, and what I'd like you to remember, of course, I'd like you to remember the 500,000 acre-feet. 60% approximately of our future water demand. We don't change anything, we just use the water more efficiently. So 330,000 acre-feet, we still got some water that we needed to develop. And I'll get to that in just a minute. I want to show you this, how are we doing in water conservation? Well, in 10 years, we've done about 15% of our 25%. You'll hear a lot of people say, oh, that's just a reaction to drought. And I think that some of what has happened is in response to the drought. And we've taken advantage of that. But I think that the line at the top, the red line, which is evapotranspiration, okay? That's how much a plant needs. If you were to give it just what it needed, that line is tracking what a plant needs. And so it has to do with precip in the specific year it's shown. It has to do with temperature, the kind of plant, all of those things, and we're using grass up there. But notice that in 2001, ET is up and usage is still down a little bit. I think that's response to drought. But then notice that the ET line, how much we need to use, is pretty much tracked by how much we're using. Those bars represent water use. And we expect the water use to be somewhat up and down. We don't expect a steady decline of 25% over 50 years. We expect that line to trend, and it is trending and what gives me confidence that our plan to use education, Utahns are really smart, to use education as a tool to get people to use water more efficiently and more wisely is working. Okay, the second thing we're going to do is ag conversion. We are not talking water farms. We're talking about taking the land that we grow alfalfa on. Most of our communities are surrounded by agricultural land. So we're talking about taking the land that we grow alfalfa on, and when we start growing houses and people on it, we just take the same water and put it into the domestic water system. We think 10% of the ag land, 80% of the water in Utah is used by agriculture. Okay, so a small effect on that will provide over 250,000 acre feet. Remember the number 330? That was what was left after conservation. So we're down in less than 100,000 acre feet that we're short to meet future needs. And how are we going to do that? Okay, the last thing is water projects. And I've listed the Bear River project and the Lake Powell pipeline because they are listed in statute, Utah state statute, as state water projects. We have not built a state water project in the past. My division has funded and assisted water users, communities, districts, irrigators in building water projects, but in 1991 the Bear River Development Act was passed, and in 2006 the Lake Powell Pipeline Act was passed that identified 2 state water projects. So we will need some additional water development. And I don't want to underemphasize that if you happen to live in a community that has no water, and there are some, that your need is immediate. So we can't just build these like blocks, like we're all interconnected. There are some communities that need water today, and some of those water projects will need to be built today for them to sustain growth, if that's what they choose. All right. Excuse me. I got up early and wrote this, so I thought I might read most of it to you, okay? So I don't ramble. One of my responsibilities is to have a plan for meeting our future water needs. I've given you a brief overview of that plan. Conservation, water conservation, ag conversion, and water projects, new water projects. The plan does not change our current landscape practices, and that's important for you to hear. It does not change our current landscape practices. The plan that I presented to you says that we will continue to have landscapes looking like they do. That's why I'm going to talk about that picture in just a minute. Someday, we may have to change those landscape practices. This picture is what I call the canopy of trees, and some of you have heard me talk about the canopy of trees, and if you hear me talk again, you'll hear me talk about the canopy of trees. For over 25 years, I've been in the west part of the valley and in different offices, but as luck will have it, I've always faced the east bench. So when I don't have my head down working, which is most of the time, right? I'm a state employee after all. Then I can see the east bench. I can see right where development ends, right where the people end, and where nature takes over, and that's the tree line. We like to live in trees, and therefore I say we live in a canopy of trees. We want that. We've chosen that. We've planted those trees, and we water those trees. Okay, and now, our outside water use is double what our inside water use is. So, take out half the trees, take out half the grass, reduce outside watering by 50%, and you can double the population. You haven't done anything except ruin something that I think is beautiful, but you can do that. Okay? Think about that. There's very tough choices to make. And I'm going to make an observation and give you an opinion. First, my observation is population drives our future water needs. There's going to be very few projects built for agriculture. Even industry, I think, will have limited ability to build water projects. I think they'll take their water from existing users. Okay, that's one observation. Second observation is that I just talked about. We use twice as much. Our landscapes, our domestic landscapes use twice as much water as we use inside the house. So, communities need to decide. Really, it's the people inside of communities need to decide what they want their communities to look like and how big they want them to be. I believe that. I don't believe it's my job. So, with that, I'll just keep making plans and figuring out how we can meet Utah's future water needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that introductory talk. And to continue with our exploration of water demand and the issues facing us in the West, next up is Anya Patinsky. She received an MA in biology and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. She joined the faculty in philosophy at the University of Utah in the fall of 2001. Her research is in history and philosophy of the biological sciences. Her work addresses the nature of models and modeling, evidence and explanation in the biological sciences, and the role of science in society, particularly environmental science and policy. Recently, she co-edited a book with Sarkar, The Blackwell's Companion to Philosophy of Biology. And today she's going to speak to us on, I guess we should, Victoria, if you can, she's going to speak to us about climate change and the risks and uncertainties associated with climate change and water resources, as well as the implications for social and legal ramifications. Anya, please.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm honored to be a member of this group of participants in this conference, and thank you so much to the organizers for doing such a fabulous job. And I also want to thank all the people I interviewed for this talk. This started actually a couple years ago. I interviewed about 20 local policymakers, climate scientists, water activists, and so all of the information I'm presenting here, I really owe a great deal to those individuals who took the time to sit down with me and explain all the complicated water law, politics, science in Utah. So the image that you see in front of you is actually an image of the 1983 flood in Salt Lake City. City Creek Canyon flooded its banks, and so downtown was a river. So I think that thinking about water and climate and the future of water in the West, I think this is a sort of striking image to think about. And that's a possibility of, well, of course, earlier spring runoff and possibility of flooding is something that we might have to think about and plan for in the future. Do I just press this? Okay. All right, so I'd like to start out reading a quotation from one of my favorite books. This is Mark Reisner's Cadillac Desert, and comes from the introduction. He's flying over the Great Basin, and this is what he says. Emptiness. There was nothing down there on the earth. No towns, no light, no signs of civilization at all. Barren mountains rose duskily from the desert floor. Isolated mesas and buttes broke the wind-haunted distance. I counted the minutes between clusters of lights. 6, 8, 9, 11. Going 9 miles a minute. That was a lot of uninhabited distance in a crowded country, in a crowded century. A lot of emptiness amid a civilization whose success was achieved on the pretension that natural obstacles do not exist. Westerners call what they've established out here a civilization, but it would be more accurate to call it a beachhead. And if history is any guide, the odds that we can sustain it would have to be regarded as low. I think Reisner does a compelling job of describing how on this beachhead, the state of Utah, Nevada, we are precariously perched, dependent upon a limited supply of water. I think Dennis Strong actually illustrated that nicely as well. And we have to think very carefully about water resources and how we plan for them in the future. But there's a new challenge that we'll be facing. We're already facing, in fact. And that is climate change. Climate change poses a very serious challenge to those who manage and plan for water in the West. Already, now this is not the future, this is actually the present. Already, mountain western states have on average become warmer relative to the century averages, 20th century averages in other states. And that's because, I guess, for the obvious reasons, right? We're inland, so climate change is going to affect us differently than, say, the coasts. We're going to be facing higher temperatures on average than even the coastal states. This is my humorous slide. So something depressing, something mildly amusing. So, but in Western states with a largely libertarian bent, the law and politics of water and climate change make a heady mix. The very claim that warming is happening, not to mention that it is caused by man-made anthropogenic activities, has divided politicians and scientists, policymakers and activists along partisan lines. And my interviews with local politicians at the Utah State Legislature made me very, very much aware of this, as well as local scientists and policymakers, lobbyists. So I interviewed Mike Noel, who's a representative at the Utah State Legislature. And if you've been following the news the past couple years, he is a climate skeptic. And his colleague and he, Representative Gibson, invited a prominent climate skeptic, Roy Spencer, to speak to the Utah State Legislature, after which the Utah House signed a non-binding agreement calling for the federal government to halt CO2 reduction programs. So perhaps ironically, this took place only a year after Governor Huntsman's Blue Ribbon Advisory Council put together a report on climate change and its potential impacts on Utah water and the economy. And this is what the council was charged with, and I just want to read it aloud because it's so compelling. Considering the science, economics, and policy around climate change in a forum where we as a state could have productive dialogue. So I think that that's what we really need to think about, is how we can have productive dialogue, how scientists, policymakers, engineers, all of us can come together and have a conversation instead of have an adversarial relationship in the way that I've represented it here. And one of my goals today is to try to make a perhaps naively optimistic suggestion about how we might do that. So despite the work of climate scientists and Huntsman and the BRAC, the message seems not to have gotten out. In the Western U.S., climate skepticism is not uncommon. A recent Gallup poll suggests that increasing numbers of Americans believe that the potential impact of and thus urgency of climate change is exaggerated. And I think that in a university setting, sometimes we might feel like we can just sort of dismiss this view as fringe. But I think we dismiss climate skeptics at our peril. And this is because, actually, Dan McCool said this to me last night. He's in the political science department, and I really liked what he said. He said, this is because we shouldn't dismiss them because they are our neighbors. They are our fellow citizens. But that's a really important reason. And it's not because necessarily they have sound scientific arguments. They're also an active political base and are some of the most vociferous public actors in state and local government, and increasingly in national government. So climate skepticism has a potential to change forever the future of our economy, our environment, and the health and well-being of future generations. So today I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to talk about the challenges that the climate change poses to water and energy in the West, the information I gathered from the climate scientists I talked to. Second, I'm going to offer a sort of reframing of a standard economic argument against climate abatement measures. And third, I'm going to discuss values. I think that climate skepticism and opposition to climate skepticism, they're not just disagreements about science or economics, but they're disagreements about values, lifestyles, and economic traditions. Self-reliance, economic independence, distrust of federal government are all part of our cultural landscape in the West. They shape our perceptions of risk, not to mention any form of authority or attempt to change lifestyles that have a long history. A premium is placed on personal liberty and minimal government. So my goal is to try to say something about how we can both acknowledge and respect our cultural norms, our cultural traditions, and plan for the future. Okay, maybe it's a little ambitious. Okay, so I'll start out with the science. This comes from a slide from Rob Gillies, who's a Utah State climatologist, and he presented this to the Utah Water Association a few years ago. So this is an image of the Hadley cell, and he explained to me how the Hadley cell and its expansion is going to impact water in the West. So increases in average global temperature are going to cause an expansion in the Hadley cell. The Hadley cell is a circulation of both water and air around the sort of center of the globe, and starting in the equator and then expanding out north to about 30 degrees north. And with the expansion of the Hadley cell, what happens is that precipitation moves north and desert areas expand. So around the center of the Earth, basically the areas that we think of as extremely dry are going to be expanding northward. There's a really nice image that Niemeyer, who's the Salt Lake City water planner, gave to me. He said, we think about the Wasatch Range as kind of like a baseball glove, right? And so water gets caught in that baseball glove as snow, and it's stored for us in order to provide drinking water and so on and so forth. But with the expansion of the Hadley cell, it's like someone's going to be maybe throwing a fly ball over our baseball glove that's catching the water that we need. So that's something to think about. So as Gillies explained, as temperature increases, even by what one might consider a small amount, say CO2 stabilization at 1.1 F, there'll be drier conditions in the southwest of Utah and further into northern Utah, and the precipitation that we count on for snowpack in the Wasatch will move north. So what does this mean? 3 things. First, the Hadley cell will create 3 central impacts. Variability in climate will increase. This means roughly that extremes in temperature and precipitation will occur more often, and weather in general will be less predictable. And according to scientists I spoke to at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, this has already happened. Usually they update their weather prediction models every 20 years. They had to update their weather prediction models sooner than they would otherwise in order to anticipate variable weather. Hotter temperature means less precipitation as snow and earlier runoff in the spring. And changing water availability has a huge potential to impact our local economies, energy development, demographic distributions, and of course the health and well-being of not just future generations, but local ecosystems, plants, and animals. Less snow and earlier spring runoff also means drier alpine forests, which leads to greater susceptibility to invasive and destructive species like the pine beetle. And forests devastated by pine beetle infestations are more subject to wildfires. Also, higher increased average temperatures in the summertime means less habitat for the trout, and trout fishing is a very attractive element of our culture here in Utah and draws a lot of tourism and money to the state. So when you think about, I believe it's increases of average summer temperatures of 3 degrees can decrease trout habitat by as much as 21%. That's a significant decrease in habitat for one of our basically big draws for state income. And here's those famous bathtub rings. Finally, and what climate scientists that I talked to took to be the most devastating and striking possibility is the possibility of mega droughts. So mega droughts are droughts that happen on the order of once every 100 years, right? And the possibility this could be happening much more frequently than they would otherwise is a serious one with climate change. So in sum, there are two sort of general classes of problem that we'll be facing with climate change in the West. What you might call, maybe to minimize it, merely complicating problems like variable weather, problems with water storage, earlier spring runoff, and catastrophic problems like major megadroughts. Catastrophic problems are where the outcome is on such a vast scale that we may need to consider radical changes in our planning for water. So Dennis Strong has already talked about this, but here are some of the impacts these might have on our state. So clearly this is going to have an impact on water demand. When the temperature goes up, the water demand goes up as well, and we're going to have an increase in population. In the western states, it's growing, pretty significantly, and less snowpack, early spring runoff, increased average temperatures, and reduced groundwater supply. All of these mean risks in possibly flooding, challenges for storage, challenges in all sections of our economy, from energy, agricultural, to industry. So we need to think seriously about paying a real price for the water we use. In the state of Utah, water is pretty cheap, and we don't have the graduated increase in what you would pay for more water. So it's something to think about seriously as a way to promote conservation. And of course, population layered over all these issues is going to complicate it yet further. So now moving on to the second piece of my talk. And this is about the cost of climate change abatement. So one of the issues that was brought up by both members of the Utah State Legislature that I talked to was that using climate change abatement was going to be too expensive. So I think when you think about the cost of climate change abatement, I think that maybe the better question is, what is the cost of not engaging in climate change abatement? Climate change has potential to impact so many sectors of our economy, from food to water to ecosystems, and of course extreme weather events can lead to disasters that can be enormously costly. Now, I promised someone who reviewed this talk that I wouldn't talk about discount rates. Oops, okay. So I won't, never mind. But one way to sort of reframe this issue of cost is to think about it less in terms of spending now to outlay future, to basically prevent future costs, is to think about it as if you were sort of buying insurance, catastrophe insurance. And actually, when you think about the distribution of costs for catastrophe insurance versus paying for the cost of climate change abatement, it doesn't turn out so bad. All right. Okay. So another thing that I talked to all of these interviewees about was their values. And a sort of set of values kept popping up again and again. And I've called them Western values. So let's see. The values that people talked about was their belief that states should be making decisions on a local level, that there should be a premium on liberty, choice in lifestyle, economic viability, local innovation, thrift, respect for the local environment, and values of future generations. And my contention is that if local political actors can see how their efforts are not only in keeping, efforts to mitigate water problems and climate change are not only in keeping with their values, but good for their economies and come from local innovation, then I'm optimistic that real change in business as usual can come about. So I talked to Noel about what he thought of the BRAC, and this is an overlong quote. But I think you can, it doesn't show up very well. His concern was he thought the Blue Ribbon Action Committee didn't come from a wide enough sector of the sort of political landscape. And, okay, so he moved quickly from the process of talking about peer review and what he thought were problems with peer review and climate change to the process by which a state governor put together a panel of experts to talk about the potential impacts of climate change. He's assimilating a scientific process to a political process. Democratic values dictate that we should be inclusive. Broad representation is a virtue. But science is not a democracy. One gains authority by acquiring expertise, and peer review means some things don't get published. But Noel, I thought, was making a point about values, and I think it's an important one. He's concerned about democratic participation in policymaking, and one of the central challenges, I think, in planning for climate change is that two cultures are confronting each other. The scientific culture is exclusive. Western democracies are inclusive. Liberty, free enterprise, free choice is at a premium. So I think that in part of the problem here is that these are just two very different cultures. Understanding how you get authority and how you make decisions is very different. So how can we overcome that cultural divide? I spoke to a fellow in New Mexico where they've actually been able to pass some important conservation laws in the state. And what Plutynski, this fellow who was on the Blue Ribbon Action Committee in New Mexico, told me was that what's really important is that you appeal to basically the shareholder interests and economic interests of people in the state and try to do things from a local level. And I think there are a number of local solutions that we can think about, and Dennis Strong has already mentioned them. One is thrift, more efficient use of existing water supplies. Secondly, consideration for future generations. This was a value shared by both left and right-leaning types that I talked to. Basically set limits on assured supply laws on growth. Invest in renewable energy and plan for adaptation with wastewater treatment and gray water. And then finally, economic viability. We need to plan future investments for a drier, hotter future. And I'm just going to skip to the very last slide here. I think if all else fails, you can ask people to make a bet on the future. And Pascals Wager, this is shamelessly stolen from a lecture that Gillies gave to the American Water Resources Association. But if you really think about it, if you think it's so problematic to argue from the science, at the very least, you can try to say, well, we should take a bet that maybe if the science is right, we'll be in a better place and act on that assumption. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anya. That was, it opens it up to the complexity and speaks to the complexity of the problem that I mentioned to begin with, and that it's beyond water. We're talking about linkages to climate, to vegetation, to ecosystems, and then even feedbacks back to human population. Next up is going to be our last speaker for this panel, and it's Zack Frankel. Zack received his BS in biology at the University of Utah and is the founder and executive director of the Utah Rivers Council, which was started in 1995. After starting the Rivers Council, Zack led the organization in a campaign to stop a proposed 260-foot high dam on the Diamond Fork River that had been proposed as part of the Central Utah Water Project. Zack also drafted Utah's first water conservation legislation, the Water Conservation Plan Act, which was passed in 1998 by the Utah State Legislature. Zack also led a 3-year campaign with farmers, ranchers, and taxpayer advocates to remove 2 proposed Bear River dams from the Bear River Development Act. In 2002, this legislation was passed. The Utah legislature unanimously on every vote but one, which was 68-2 in favor. So Zack is going to speak to us about a number of issues. He's going to continue to talk to the complexity of the problem, especially with related to uncertainties and how we work with people and laws and how they impact and affect us. So please help me welcome Zack.
Thank you. My wife tells me that the definition of a geek is someone who brings their own laser pointer to a debate, but what can I do? Here it is. All right, well, thank you if I'm technologically proficient, I will walk through this. So one of the things I wanted to look at in this presentation was where Utah ranks relative to the rest of the world in its water use. And this is a table from the Pacific Institute, Dr. Peter Glick, called The World's Water, 2008-2009. You can actually find this table online. So what you see here are the top 3 water users in the world that are listed by total freshwater withdrawals. Let's see. Okay, if you can see this. You can see the U.S. is 3rd behind India and China in total freshwater withdrawals. If you look at the second column, per capita withdrawals, you can see that the United States is tops for per capita withdrawals. Oh, wonderful, thank you. There we go. So right there, 1,600 cubic meters per person per year. So that's a significant amount of water. Now, these are listed in order from the first column, so you can see Pakistan and Japan there listed afterwards. So the United States is one of the biggest water users in the world just by total freshwater withdrawals. If you look at per capita withdrawals, you'll see, as I mentioned, that we're quite large, but we're not the tops. According to this data, 29th on the list of total freshwater withdrawals is how I ranked them, is Turkmenistan, which has a higher per capita withdrawal. Now, whether this data is because data collection in Turkmenistan might be a little limited, or whether it's just so few people with so much water diverted, i.e. an inefficient delivery system, is frankly unknown. But it's clear that the United States is, like many resources, using far too much water given our small population. This is important to talk about because we don't really have terms in the water supply industry to talk about waste. We talk about use and we talk about need, but the difference between need and waste is rarely addressed. There's very few metrics. If you want to go look and say, well, who's the biggest water waster? It's really hard to figure out. Yet clearly there's waste out there. Now, for the last 30 years, both Utah and Nevada, for per capita domestic use, are always number 1 and 2, the highest per capita water users. Now, domestic use, of course, we're talking about basically residential use. And like many things in water, simple questions get complicated very, very quickly. But you can see, this is, I believe, this is a 2,000-year data. But since the period between 1950 and 2000, we had a 90% population increase in the United States. But our water use increased 127%, which is another way of saying our per capita withdrawals, our per capita water use went up disproportionately to our population. So clearly there's something going on there. Both Utah and Nevada are proposing extravagant and expensive water projects to satisfy what they deem need for very destructive and unsustainable purposes. We'll get into that in a minute. So the primary question driving all policy in water, at least in Utah, is Utah running out of water? And in my many years working on water, the single most commonly asked question I get is, when are we running out of water? I get that all the time from laymen. We must be running out of water, right? I mean, we must be, right? So here is typical water conservation planning in Utah. So this bottom line here is projected demand over time from the year 2000 to the year 2060, excuse me. The line on top, that dotted line, is what it would be if we didn't conserve any water use from the year 2000 forward. Obviously, the reason that the chart is increasing is because of population growth. This is looking at the Salt Lake Valley. And so the goal is to reduce water use down 25% by the year 2060. Okay? So we'll come back to this in a minute. But it's a 25% reduction in per capita use. Again, we're just talking about domestic use. So we're not talking about agricultural use. If you look at this, you'll see this is let's talk about water use in Utah. So agricultural water use in Utah is between 80 and 85%, depending on the year, of total water use in the state. So agriculture is unquestionably using the lion's share of Utah's water. Up here in that blue sector is municipal and industrial use. That's about 15% of all the water used in Utah on an annual basis. If you take that blue wedge and you discard the industrial users, which are about a third to 40% of that municipal and industrial sector, you toss that and you just look at the municipal sector. We're really interested in residential use, how much water you and I are using in our homes. And you'll see that depending on the year, indoor water use is 25 to 35% water use of the total. Outdoor water use is the lion's share. 65 to 75% of our residential water use is outside the home, okay? A couple of things to point out. So first of all, 98% of Utah's population lives in that blue sector. Farming and ranching agricultural interests account for less than 2% of Utah's population. Well, I'm not trying to say I'm anti-agriculture. I like farms and ranches. But when you're talking about need, it's important to look at this. It is widely believed we could reduce this outdoor sector by 50% in terms of water use. It's widely believed, for example, we could reduce Salt Lake Valley water use by 25%, this outdoor water use, without removing one blade of grass. Okay? So there's waste going on here. Okay? About half that sector of water use is wasted, which is another way of saying that 98% of Utah's population is using between 6 and 7% of Utah's total water to overwater lawns, gutters, and sidewalks. Just as a photo here, if you can see that little fountain shooting up in this person's yard. We've all seen this. We've all seen little gutters full of water in the summer. So this is what is called use, and commonly on paper referred to as need. This unconscious water consumption drives billions of dollars in new water development. And again, as I said, this waste is commonly referred to as use or need because we don't have metrics to figure out how much of our use is waste. So here is the governor's water conservation team. This is some of the select data set. So again, over here you'll see 2,000-year water use. So that's about 299 gallons per person per day based on the sampling of water use of these cities. And you'll see, of course, over the years, the water use has gone up and down. Again, 2000 is the base year that was used to project water use out for 60 years. Now, there's a couple of ways to think about projecting use. The first is, well, how are we going to figure out where to set the baseline of water use? One way would be to average the water using years and say that's our base use. That's how much we quote-unquote need, right? Because it's going up and down. Why would you pick one year to make a 60-year projection that billions of dollars of taxpayer funds are dependent on? Well, if you do that, you find that water use declines from 2000, for the average of this 8-year set, water use declines 13%. So in just the use, water use declined 13%. If you were to say we're going to average these water years to determine the base need, you are more than halfway to meeting your water conservation goal by the year 2060. All you did was use a calculator, and you just deferred billions of dollars in new spending with a calculator. If you take, for example, the lowest water year, 233, and you say we're going to make that the baseline and project out need for 60 years, you just saved 22% of water use. In other words, you came within 3% of meeting the water conservation goal set out to the year 2060, just by choosing that year. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's Las Vegas, one of the most wasteful water users in the country because Las Vegas is so incredibly hot. Las Vegas's water use is here, 250. 50 gallons per person per day less than the base year that was selected to project quote-unquote need. Las Vegas's water conservation goal is to get to 199, about 200, which is about a 25% reduction. So you can see that Las Vegas actually has a more aggressive water conservation goal than we do. That's a pretty common story when you look at Western cities. Denver's water use 211, Albuquerque 216. On the bottom, you'll see Jordan Valley's water use, one of the largest wholesale suppliers of water. In the Salt Lake Valley is 255 by comparison. So almost all these cities have lower per capita water use. All right, and Utah's average is the 2,000 years 299, about 300. So again, if you look at these cities' water conservation goals, you'll see that the implementation deadline for those water conservation goals are all sooner than the year 2060. Well, why does that matter? Imagine that you came home and your spouse said to you, you know, we are spending way too much money on the credit card. We have got to cut down our spending. So I've set the goal that we're going to reduce credit card spending by 0.5% every month. Now, obviously, that's not a very aggressive goal to reduce credit card spending, right? 0.5%, you would say, honey, you're not really serious about this, are you? If you're going to reduce your credit card spending, you're going to go at least 10% a month. You're going to really try and whack your spending down. Our water conservation goal here in the state of Utah is 0.5% per year for the next 50 years. It's hard to call that aggressive. And one of the reasons is for our wasteful water use is the price of our water is the cheapest in the country. It's the absolute cheapest in the western U.S. These three bars here are three Salt Lake Valley cities, Salt Lake City and West Jordan and Provo. So here are the water rates you can see for the three Salt Lake Valley cities that we've chosen. And there's a number of cities that we've put up there you can see. So the valley's water use is, the water rates are so low that they're clearly encouraging waste. Let me give you an example. Provo, this map doesn't quite do it justice. The summer rate in Provo is 64 cents per 1,000 gallons, okay? And Seattle, which gets much, much, much more rainfall coming out of the sky, the base rate starts at $5.60. So it's hard to get serious about water conservation if we're not going to price it. We're encouraging people to waste water. And you see this again and again. Sandy City, for example, where I live, doesn't have a rate structure. In the summer, you pay the same amount of water whether you use 2 gallons or whether you use 200,000 gallons. In Sandy, the rate structure, the top tier, well, there is no tier, but you pay $2.45. And in Tucson, you pay $13 per 1,000 gallons for the top tier. So we really can't talk seriously about water conservation without talking about how we price water. Dr. Gail Blattenberger did a study of the price of water in Salt Lake County and found that only about 50% of the cost of delivering water to us is paid for in our water bills. The rest of the payments are made up in a collection of property sales and income taxes. We collect property taxes in Utah on people's homes to subsidize the price of water and make it cheaper. We wanted to see what other Western suppliers did that. So we surveyed 60 water suppliers in the major metro areas, and we found that only 22% of Western water suppliers in our sample of 60 collect property taxes. 78% do not collect property taxes to subsidize water rates. We found that there was a small collection, a small 20% of Western water suppliers have the authority but do not collect property taxes because encouraging water use creates headaches for water suppliers. If the goal in Utah is to sell water, we're doing a great job. If the goal in Utah is to reduce water use, to reduce waste, then we're not even really trying to go after it. One of the things you talk about here, this is a farmland that was for sale. This is the same land 10 years later, now developed into new uses. If you take a farm like this and you turn it into municipal use, you're actually going to end up using less water per square foot. Why? Because, of course, we're not irrigating this road. Well, at least hopefully we're not irrigating this road. So what you see in the water sector, getting back to this graph, is that municipal and industrial growth actually ends up eating up this water sector. So, oh, great, that means that we're going to have a surplus of water over time, right? Well, the truth of the matter is that that water just sits in speculation. It doesn't get transferred for a whole series of reasons, which we don't have time to get into, unfortunately. Salt Lake County has 25,000 acre-feet of water that used to be irrigated acreage that's now just sitting around being diverted in canals. There's only about 9,000 acres of farmland left in Salt Lake County. That means that's about 14 acre-feet per acre of water use. That's enough to grow 5 crops of alfalfa hay, which isn't being done because you can't grow 5 crops in one season. That's enough water for 500,000 wasteful Utahns. So we're all taught that Western water law is about use it or lose it, but the truth is it's not really. Because unless somebody makes them give up their water, they can just sit on the water. So who cares about water rates, property taxes? Who cares about all that? Well, this is the Bear River. This is proposed for development. And the Bear River flows off the north slope of the Uintas, and it provides 60% of the surface water inflow to the Great Salt Lake every year. And the Great Salt Lake provides bird habitat, migratory bird habitat in its shoreline wetlands for about 250, 270 species of migratory birds, some of which are in larger populations than anywhere else in North America. I'm running out of time, so I can't get into all of it, but it's really remarkable. If you've never been out to the Bear River Bird Refuge, you need to go see it, because you might not get that chance in another 20 years. The proposed Bear River development is a $1 billion water project that would deliver 50,000 acre-feet to Salt Lake Valley among other counties that would receive the water. It would divert about 18% of the Bear River's flow upstream of the bird refuge. Okay, so it's been estimated that that in alone could drop the Great Salt Lake down in elevation by 2 to 4 feet. It's hard to know how many wetlands would dry up. It's estimated there's about 1 million acres of wetlands around the lake. It could be that we dry up 20, 40, 50, 100,000 acres of wetlands. We really don't know. No one's really studied this in very much detail. There's a lot of money being put into diverting the water, not much being spent on looking at what the impacts will be. If you look at climate change, preliminary analysis of just the climate alone is that the climate change will result in a 5 to 18% reduction in runoff of the Bear River alone. Just talking about the Bear, not talking about any of the other rivers that feed the lake. So if you bring these two proposed impacts, well, the one proposed impacts from Bear River development, about a 20% reduction in flow, plus reduction in flow from climate change, you could see anywhere from 25 to 40% reduction in inflows to the Great Salt Lake's largest water source. So you could see bird populations dying from scores and scores and scores of populations of migratory birds. Incredibly, this question is barely being posed right now in the debate, and there aren't really any good answers. So what do we know? Well, the first thing we know is that the projection of our water needs are generous at best. In many regards, the water conservation goal is anemic. We believe that the projection of need is the baseline of what our water conservation goal is. So if we want to reduce water use from there, it seems pretty easy to get to that second arrow, which means we don't really need to import any additional supply. It's also clear that some agencies are heavily vested in needing to build this water project. The document where I found this water demand curve, I found 27 assertions of need to build this document on page 1. I didn't find one single analysis of whether we can avoid spending this money. The question wasn't even posed, do we really need this water? It was just asserted that we do. There's no questions or comparisons about using water rates. If I could raise your rates 20%, but that would save you $500 million in taxpayer future expenses in the long term, you'd probably be interested in doing that, all right? Because it's a long-term analysis. But these kinds of questions aren't even being posed, much less answered. So to conclude, climate change in Utah will test many water institutions' abilities to conduct suitable planning. The planning requires some soul searching about the difference between waste and need, what a need really is. The pressure which climate change will place upon many aquatic ecosystems, certainly in Utah, has the potential to push many species into extinction. New water diversions will have much greater impacts upon natural ecosystems in the current climate change world based on the stereo impact of what man is proposing and climate change together. If pursued, these proposals will combine to exterminate desert aquatic ecosystems in Utah. It's a question of when, which ones, and how often. So the decision about whether to engage in such proposals should be done with a transparent discussion of their impacts. And none of the engineering proposals should be pursued without the use of fair and modern economic analysis, which consider the value of ecosystems' survival and all the tools in the toolkit. By saying that, what I mean, of course, is that there is a value to having fish live in streams. It's a value that comes back to Utah in economic inputs from tourism. There's a value to bird watching. These things are not being registered in the discussion, and they need to be. And with that, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Zach, Dennis, and Anya, and I'd like to go ahead and invite them up to the panel table to take questions from the audience. So give them a few seconds, and do we have a microphone that we could use? Or just yell it out?
Is it working? Great. My question is for Zach, actually, and perhaps Dennis. My name's Susan Spronk, and I'm going to be talking in the afternoon, and one of the places I do a lot of work is Bolivia. So my question is about water rates, which is a debate that is at the international level, domestic level as well, and I just wanted to underline some of the dangers around one of the arguments as framed, although I'm not sure you wanted to make this argument, about people are wasting water, therefore we have to raise the rates in order to reduce the water consumption. I absolutely agree, but I think it's important to point out some of the problems around social equity of such a proposal. Specifically, the kind of reduction we're looking at is trying to reduce swimming pools and watering lawns, which is typically not an activity that one finds amongst lower income residents of Salt Lake City. And so I'm wondering, or perhaps suggesting, that one of the elements of the explanation should be talking about rising block tariffs, about making sure to protect those lower income residents and their consumption needs versus the swimming pool people who certainly need to be penalized for their overuse and overconsumption of water. And just to remind the room of something that Maud pointed out last night, which was problems that they've had in Detroit, where such policies of raising the water rates led to cutoffs of, Maud was saying something like 90,000 people in the city of Detroit. Again, a city in which there's a large number of low income. So it's more of a comment than a question, but just to put on the table the question of rising block tariffs as perhaps a policy that needs to be talked about when talking about water rates.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. You know, I certainly agree that we need to make sure that low-income residents especially are not penalized. You know, the trick is not to penalize high water users, at least initially. The trick is to make users of their water pay. So if you look at the property tax subsidy, the 20% that is subsidized out of everybody's property taxes, the interesting thing about that is that low-income populations are actually subsidizing the rich to waste water. Why? Because most low-income populations have, of course, smaller lot sizes or live in multifamily apartment complexes, which themselves are using less water per capita than these palatial lawns. But because, so in other words, you know, larger lot users have a higher per capita water use. So we really need to remove the property tax because it's penalizing low-income populations and encouraging water waste, especially among the large users. The University of Utah, where we all sit, for example, uses somewhere around 10, 12, 14% of Salt Lake City's water use, but of course doesn't pay any property taxes for its water use. Now, some of its water use is self-supplied, and they build their own system. But, we're all still subsidizing the university to waste water, and, those students and professors, I'm sure, have walked across campus and found great pools of water. So the thing about water conservation is that there certainly is some merit to educating people about doing the right thing. There's a whole other group of people that just don't care about that aspect of it, and there needs to be an economic signal to reduce waste. But we do need to be careful that, certainly we're not advocating just arbitrarily increasing water rates because, it's the right thing to do. The question is, getting back to the lower income populations, what percent of the $1 billion of new water projects are they going to pay for? So it's really hard to say. So clearly they have zero interest in additional expenses there. But I think your point is excellent.
Dennis, any comments?
No? You make an excellent point. I don't care how you price water. If you want to take it out of the property tax, it's not going to change what water costs. So if Zach's right and lower income people are being penalized, it ought to be changed. I don't think that was the intent. Some of it has to do with how long it takes to build a water project, but I think that water should be priced fairly. And I told you earlier that I think we ought to decide what our communities look like. Some of the cost of water, or how much water we use, not the cost, but how much water we use, is because we want our communities to look a certain way. And we want it to look nice, whether you have a lot of money or a little bit of money. So go Google what a public service sector essential service is. And one of those things is water. And if you'd like to change that, do that in your community.
Other questions? Michael?
Michael Campana from Oregon State University. I also have a charitable nonprofit that works in developing countries. I don't know how many, and this question is directed to anybody who chooses to answer it. I don't know how many of you have read James Powell's Deadpool, but in that book he has a very apocalyptic version of Phoenix, a couple-page description about a steady stream of cars leaving and water police armed with weapons and the whole thing. Now, I live in a very wet area, Western Oregon. We get 1 meter of rain per year, but that's not a good reason you should come to live there, okay, because it comes about 5 or 6 months. But I'm curious, have you personally, or do you know of people who are looking at perhaps the civil disorder that could result from a catastrophic depopulation of the arid Southwest? And I say this as someone who has spent virtually all his adult life in the Southwest, Reno, Albuquerque, Tucson, and love it very much. But I get emails from potential climate refugees about 4 or 5 each month. So I was just wondering if anybody, because I never hear anybody talk about that, and I realize it's not an easy thing to broach because you may lose your job. So
I'd actually really love to talk about that. So Jared Diamond's book Collapse and the movie they made out of it really hit home to me. If you don't have much time, go see the movie because it is a group of future anthropologists excavating the shards of American civilization to understand why we collapsed. And one of the biggest things that hit me was water use. You know, that's the whole point about talking about need and use and waste. You know, what we need and what we use are so different in this country, and as Americans, we constantly forget that. You know, I believe it was the year 2000, for the first time ever, there were more refugees fleeing environmental crisis than war. And yet still that doesn't come out in discussion. So climate change is going to do more than just drive up water rates or make your local fishing hole, you know, kill off all the fish. Climate change does have the potential to end our civilization. And that's what Dr. Diamond talks about, is in the next few decades, the decisions we make will determine the fate of our civilization, not necessarily how we live, but whether we live. I don't mean to be scary about it, but it is important to define need and use.
Several of the climate scientists that I talked to here at the University of Utah compared the possibility of mega droughts that we might be having with the kind of droughts the Anasazi faced in the Southwest. So it's not just fantasy. These are droughts that, that might be predicted based on the best climate models.
So the Aussies are a good example when they left. I think they left peacefully because they ran out of water and maybe fuel. They cut a lot of trees down too, I think. But if you look at just in the last 20 years, I pulled population numbers and I won't bore you with them, but more than half of our growth in Utah is what they call organic. That's our kids. And so if you look in 1980, about 2/3 of the immigration or the growth in Utah was our own kids. It dropped to 50%, I think, in 1990. Well, last year, our children represented 97%. And why? Because the people who didn't have jobs left. And they're not coming because there aren't jobs. So I think that out-migration is a real possibility, but I don't see it through civil disobedience. I think that's playing it a little too far.
This is song. Oh, there we go. I'm just curious how anybody could speak to this really, if we were able to tie up some water in conservation, if there's any discussion how that might get locked into remaining in the river, remaining in aquifers, etc., without, short of changing the entire doctrine of prior appropriation. Thanks.
Well, what you're talking about then would be in-stream flows. And, you could change the entire prior appropriation. I'd probably be okay with that. But if you're going to do in-stream flows, there's a kind of a weak in-stream flow law in Utah. It's better than nothing. But most rivers in Utah don't really have a legal right to exist. There's somebody else's water right on its way downstream, and that's why it happens to be there. And that's the sad truth of it. The dialogue that happens in rooms like this about what should happen and the dialogue that happens in the legislative committee rooms are worlds apart, as any of us know that go in those rooms. So certainly there needs to be some preservation of the conservation of the stream flows for the benefit of everyone and future generations. It's for me, it's always comes down to political calculus to make it happen. But it's an excellent question.
The answer is yes, we ought to talk about it, from my point of view.
Hi, LaDawn Hagman from Arizona State University, living in the Phoenix area, possible future refugee. I'm actually interested in this question that was sort of briefly mentioned but not discussed, which is the question of that 85% that goes to agriculture. And it seems to me a little bit short-sighted to not think through our decisions, because they are decisions about how we allocate water and whether it is a good idea to grow crops in the desert. And if especially the people who are actually working on policy have thought through some alternative scenarios for feeding the population and trying to reduce that very, very large consumption that goes to agriculture.
I think something that actually all of us mentioned was transfer of ag to municipal and industrial uses, which is hopefully going to reduce that consumption. But also, a lot of the crops, as I understand it, are not really food crops for people. They're food crops for animals. And so thinking about what might be more sensible to grow in the desert, I think, is absolutely essential, yes. But with prior appropriation law, it becomes a challenge, because if you're first in use and you happen to grow alfalfa and your grandpa grew alfalfa and his grandpa grew alfalfa, it's hard to change those things unless you have a lot of money and you can build a new housing development and buy up those. Yes.
Okay, so irrigators are becoming somewhat like the humpback chip. You know, there's just getting to be less and less of them. And I think that you're going to see that continuing. There will still be some focus on agriculture, but I think economics will drive what happens to water for agriculture. One of the things that you need to look at, and you can look at, I don't know if Zach showed the chart of where the ag ground is, but you can find that on our website. And the ag ground is not necessarily where the people are. So you're talking about mega projects again, very expensive projects to bring that water in. And I think it's going to be an economic consideration. There's not much water left to develop. When Zach talks about the Bear River, and he and I have been talking about the Bear River for a really long time, and he's been successful, and I think I have been too, in the fact that we're not really talking about building it anytime soon. And so there'll be a lot more talk before it is built, and a lot more public dialogue, and some of the things that need to happen that haven't happened yet will happen. So anyway, I think there's an economic piece of this that will just play out. And I don't know the decision makers. I'm a decision maker. I think our water is going to come, some of our water for population growth is going to come from agriculture. I told you that earlier.
I think I agree. And I think one of the challenges, first off, is that, you know, in talking about growing food, you know, that the more local you can grow your food, the better off it is for the population. It's the less use of resources. So that's important. But before you get to crop types, before you get to whether you should have agriculture, you know, the question is, how do you use the water? And you're talking, as Anya said, you're talking about the primary, the first-in-time users. But you know, it's really, really, really hard to be an American farmer or rancher. You know, these guys are making $2 an hour, and so they don't have any capital to invest in making their delivery systems more efficient, which is the biggest need first, is just make it more efficient before you say, we're not going to farm here because it's a waste of resources. You could reduce water use there in that sector immensely if you had the capital to do it, which is, again, a political problem because all the capital's in the cities. People don't want to pay for these very expensive canal systems. It's not uncommon to go out to a farm and find that for every 8 gallons diverted from the source, only 1 gallon is used on the crops. It's just enormously inefficient. So you could keep your agriculture, most of your Western agriculture, and you could still save tons and tons and tons of water. But the conservation community says, well, if I save this water, I can't put it in the river because Utah law is hostile to in-stream flows, and I can't even buy that water and put it in the river. So I think there's a little bit of a balancing act. I'm very much pro-agriculture. I'm very much interested in seeing farmland preserved. America's lost 40 million acres of prime farmland in the last couple decades under blacktop. That's not a good policy. We're becoming more dependent on imports for our food supply. That's not a good policy. But you're right. There are definitely places where Western agriculture is just nonsensical.
Let me do this really quickly. You know, it's surprising how often Zach and I agree. But in this particular place, we don't agree. And let me tell you why. The All-American Canal was lined recently. You've read about that. And Mexico sued the United States. And why did they sue the United States? Because if we lined that darn canal, it dried up wetlands, and really probably more significant for them, it was some of their aquifers got dried up. Okay, so let's go up to Brigham City and let's dry up. No, that's wrong. Let's go up to Brigham City and line the canals. Now, what happens, they have basically a full water supply today. So you can apply the water more efficiently, and if you do that, and I tell you that the water that they're not using to grow the crop, some of it evaporates, some of it's used for phytophytes, but a lot of it flows through the refuge, and that's important to me. If you were to take that water, conserve it, if you want to call that conservation, and divert it to Salt Lake City, it doesn't flow through the bird refuge anymore. So think about what you're doing. Reuse is talked about as a panacea sometimes, but where does our water reuse go typically? To a lake, the Great Salt Lake, the Utah Lake. When you talk about agricultural conservation, because all too often it's a downstream user, could be another farmer that you're talking about, but in the case of Brigham City, Box Elder County, it's the bird refuge.
going to say, I think Bear Lake is very essential in so many ways to the whole state. It's the only freshwater lake we have. Oh, not freshwater lake, but it is basically. We don't have another lake to compare with in size. And to think of that going down to the size that it would, and the birds that would be killed, and everything else, and the whole area in that part of Utah and Idaho to sort of be destroyed is just unthinkable. And I think the people that are aware of that, and I think there are lots of people that are aware of it, I think those people are evidently not being represented at all. But it's the whole state that would suffer again. It's like the Great Salt Lake and so on. But why isn't that being talked of and represented in these political discussions? They said that hasn't even come up, the aesthetic value of the lake. I can't understand it because there's been Bear Lake Watch that has been quite diligent in trying to educate people to the value of the lake to the state, and for it not to even be discussed among the political solutions and such seems just unthinkable to me. What has happened here?
There's a value debate going on. I think Anya referenced it pretty clearly. You know, the water suppliers in Utah are called water conservancy districts. The reason they're called conservancy districts is because back when they were created, conservation meant diverting a river before it got wasted into the lake. And early on when I started this work, I remember I got into a panel discussion with former Senator Jake Arnn. Sorry, not a prediction there. And Jake Arnn told me that I was completely out of it because most Utahns felt like water entering the lake was wasted. And I said, no, you're totally wrong. Most Utahns feel like water, entering the lake is a good use, and that if we divert it for waste, that's wasteful. And there were, at the time of this, there were like 100 people in the room. And we kept going on about this point for an hour and 15 minutes until we were the only two people in this gigantic room. And we were really working hard to convince each other of our value system. And we were at loggerheads completely, although he's very polite and wonderful about it. So there's a value debate going up there in the legislature, and there are just a huge number of legislators that feel that way, that water entering the river or staying in the river or entering the lake is wasted. It's a value debate. And that's why it's so important that we bring so many more people to the debate that have different values and can have a balancing act.
You said in your speech that you were talking about we need to decide what our communities look like and how big we want them to grow. I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how to limit population growth in certain areas, maybe that don't have as much water. I know Washington County is the driest county and the second driest state in the country. Just the question about maybe where we should be growing and how to address that.
But I promise to tell you that I'm not in charge of population, and I'm not. And so if I got ideas, talk to me afterwards and we can talk about it. I'm not going to say it. Okay.
Zack or Anya?
Yeah, I always am happy to wade into the contentious issues. Population's a toughie. It's the Pandora's box of discussion that no one wants to open, unfortunately. And, for me, you've got 1 in 4 legislators in Utah that are involved in the real estate industry, which is a growth industry. There's some wonderful, wonderful people up there, really great people. But it's not easy what the solution is. It's not clear. Even if you were able to convince Dennis here, I don't know what his personal views are, but let's say he did want to try and control population. He would.
I've got 8 kids and 2 wives.
Well, even what the Division of Water Resources can do about population growth is clearly quite limited. So So it's not really clear how you're going to address population. It's a tough issue.
But do it.
This is going to be the last question.
Oh, well, thank you. My name is Jared Parkinson. I'm a private water rights attorney here in Salt Lake City. And often I sit on both sides of the table when the rubber hits the road at the state engineer's office in the hearings on movement of water rights. And that's where I see the whole debate about public policy and ecosystem and our value of the ecosystem drop flat. When you go to hearings and there's always somebody who says, well, what about the fish or what about the bird refuge? And it's stated, it's there in the hearing, but never really gets any traction. I've looked at the laws behind this, and I don't see many cases going up on it, and I don't see a lot of movement in giving the state engineer and the people making these decisions the power to actually give the ecosystem a voice. I'm wondering if you see anything happening in the legislature, any public policy makers who are really standing up for the ecosystem on this front to give the power where the decisions are being made.
No.
Everyone I talked to said we got to use more water to keep it in the state. That's the sort of line that I hear is, well, we got to use all of our allocation, otherwise it's going to go to, Phoenix. That's that at least who I talk to.
Okay, so sometime called water buffalo, that would be me. Let me take a little credit for some of what's being done, and it's in response to ESA mostly. But I sit on committees and in organizations where we are dealing with ESA issues. The chub in the Colorado River, recovering endangered fishes in the Green River. It's possible. You won't tell, will you? But Water Resources might take an in-stream type bill to the legislature to protect the endangered fishes in the Green River. But you've got to remember why. Because if we're not in compliance with ESA, we can't take our water out. So it's not totally altruistic, but there is some concern and some direction change. Obviously, I believe some direction change. I think there was a recent ruling by the state engineer on the White River where it was said in the granting of a water right that once the water flow in the White River gets below 161 CFS, that you don't take any more water out. And that's because of the fish. So I think you're seeing baby steps being taken. So we're not totally ignorant, and we're not certainly immune from environmental consequences or laws.
I would just add to that that really until the people show up at their state house and demand that the environment has a value and should be registered in state law, it's just not going to happen. I mean, Dennis mentioned the the Endangered Species Act. That's always the club, and unfortunately, it's a crummy club to have because you don't want to have to hit anybody with it. You would rather work it out and say, look, let's just have the river flow. We're not asking to take away your lifestyle, but let's leave some water in the stream. So it's just a very lonely dialogue up there for us conservationists. It's not uncommon to find. And today, go up there, and you can count the number of environmental lobbyists up there, typically on one hand, often one finger. So until people show up and enter the dialogue, it's just that there is no one advocating on it. So your observation is an excellent one, and it's really a challenge to even advocate, much less win on that level, is very difficult.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis, Anya, and Zack, for your help. Please help me thank them. And thank you so much for joining us this morning for this session. The conference is going to continue we have a short break for lunch, and then at 12:15, we're going to have the keynote lecture from Dr. Peter Glick, and then an afternoon session back in here after that. Thank you very much.